You know, the first time I ever heard about climate change and the possibility of climate change was, I believe, about 40 years ago from the work of Murray Bookchin, who in early 1970s was writing about the way industrial society might be disrupting the core natural cycles of the natural world. And this was so far out that it was not even something that was widely discussed on the left, right, or center, or anywhere else. And yet, even from that ancient vantage point, you could see that industrial society was challenging the basis of human life, and that our economic and political systems were at the core of what the problem was. And now, as Traven mentioned, I work with a group called the Labor Network for Sustainability, which is trying to draw together the labor movement and climate protection, environmental, and more broadly sustainability movements to develop exactly what this workshop title says, the idea that we are or should be natural allies. Now, we know, and I'm sure all of you are all too aware, that there's a lot of difficulty and tension in that alliance, and it's coming to a head now around Keystone pipeline, and also around all the other questions around growth, economic growth, jobs, and wherever, in fact, there is an environmental or climate issue that an employer can claim is going to hurt jobs, whether it's mountaintop removal, coal-fired power plants, you name it. The issue of jobs versus the environment, and the attempt to frame the issue as jobs versus the environment is something that we find, which, as people who are supportive of labor, who are supportive of the environment, and God help us most of all, for those of us who are supporters of both, find ourselves hit over the head with at every turn. Now, we could go on and talk about that and the details of it at length, but I want to do something different. I want to talk about what are the ways in which that division between, or alleged division between interests of workers and concern about the environment, of jobs versus environmental protection. What are the ways in which that can be answered and overcome? I want to just very briefly go through 5 levels at which that we can work to respond to that. The first one is the broadest and most cosmic, but one that I think is becoming progressively compelling for people, which is that we have a common human interest in survival, and we have a common human interest in having a society that allows us to have a livelihood. And those are things that every human being has in common and shares, and they're not something that we can get away from by saying, well, I'm a worker, so I don't have to worry about the environment, or I'm an environmentalist and I don't have to worry about making a living. It's not true. It's very much part of the same existence that we have as human beings. Fundamentally, there is no conflict, there is a unity. And that's something that we can build into our talking, and the way we approach things, and the way we think about things, and the way we communicate with our friends and neighbors and communities. The second level is that the conflicts which are real can be resolved in a very different kind of economic and social system. That's what ecosocialism is all about. That's what people who talk about rebuilding the commons have in mind. That's what the people who talk in terms of a new economy have in mind. A change that's radical enough so that things that seem conflicting, like, well, should we build a pipeline and have jobs but destroy the environment, or should we not build the pipeline and have the jobs? These questions go away if you have a rational form of planning in which the whole range of different interests of different people and the different interests that individuals have can be coordinated in a way that allows those things to be not contradictory. And so we can say, well, we can have an energy system that's not based on building a pipeline to carry stuff that's going to destroy the environment, and we can have jobs building that pipeline, or not building that pipeline, but maybe building a water line and building solar panels or whatever it may be. In other words, if you change the framework of in which you try to solve the problem, you can solve problems that are insoluble. Okay, but this is still, we're talking about things that are a very long time in the future and very hard to realize. Let's move this down a few more steps towards concreteness. The next level down, so to speak, less revolutionary and less utopian, is a common interest of workers and people who are concerned about the environment in a reform agenda that unites the need to protect the climate, the need to protect the environment, the need for jobs. The Green New Deal is a phrase that's often used for this kind of approach, and while it's not going to pass the United States House of Representatives in the year 2013, we can certainly see that this is something that is a kind of approach as established neoliberalism produces deeper and deeper recessions, more and more climate crisis, et cetera, is going to come onto the agenda. Coming onto the political agenda doesn't guarantee that it'll win, but the way in which it's been not discussable in the last 30 years is, I believe, almost certain to be overcome in the next few years, and it will be an alternative that's there in people's minds. Then the next level has to do with issues around which specific alliances can be built. I'm going to give two quick examples, and I hope that we'll hear more about them. But there's been, some of you may know that two of the transportation unions were two of the unions that came out against the Keystone Pipeline. And we're going to hear more about that. I'm not going to go into that at depth because there's people here who were centrally involved with that. But there's a broader story behind that, which is the transportation unions realizing that, you might think, well, climate change is going to, restricting greenhouse gases. No. We drive buses, we drive trains, they emit greenhouse gases. We can't get involved with that. No, that's not, there's been a process through which the transportation unions have come to agree. Different unions have different levels of take on this, but essentially has said public transportation, which they work in, is a big part of the solution to climate change. And if you begin to replace people stuck in traffic jams with public transportation, you create jobs for transit workers, and the way you make that, the politics of that is to make an alliance with people who are concerned about climate change. Where I live in Connecticut, we have created a Connecticut Roundtable on climate and jobs, which has the unions, the environmental groups, a lot of religious groups, and community organizations in it. And we've been involved. It was about a year old, but at the moment it's deeply involved with a campaign to preserve the renewable energy standards in the state energy policy, which is basically the core of a strategy for making jobs in Connecticut and in New England by requiring that the power companies that supply electricity have solar and other forms of renewable energy as a growing component of their energy supply. And this is something where people, you think about conflict between labor and environmentalists, but this is a case where there's a strong confluence of interest, and we've pulled those groups together to make that confluence of interest be expressed in the state, the current, it's probably as we speak, debate on energy policy. Finally, let me talk about the most difficult one, which is the cases where there are direct efforts by environmental groups to either shut down fossil fuel producing and using facilities, or to prevent new ones from being built. And conversely, where labor organizations are fighting to build pipelines or to prevent regulation of greenhouse gases by the EPA. This is where the toughest, most difficult conflicts come. And of course, the KXL pipeline would be a classic and prime example of that. And what I want to suggest is that even in those situations, we can look for more constructive, more win-win ways of dealing with them than just saying the environmental movement saying, well, to hell with them, they've been making their money off of destroying our environment and pouring the fossil fuel crap into our atmosphere, forget about those workers. Or conversely, where the trade unionists say all those environmentalists want to do is to destroy our jobs, and let them go eat let them eat a polar bear if they're not going to let us produce the things that are needed to make a modern industrial civilization go. And I just did a study of coal-fired power plants, which are another place where this set of issues comes directly to the fore. And in those situations where there's an environmental campaign, it's usually done by a local coalition that involves environmental justice groups and usually big green groups like the Sierra Club and local community groups. In those situations, there's almost always some kind of direct conflict between the union representing the people in the plants and the environmental groups that are trying to shut down those coal-fired power plants. But I looked at 7 or 8 cases which had, in one way or another, developed a degree of cooperation, usually first just tacit, and then eventually a kind of win-win settlement that may not be exactly what everyone wanted, but which in a number of these cases actually allowed the unions to support the closing, phased closing of a coal-fired power plant. And I'm just going to mention 2 very briefly. And how are we doing on time? I'm a little bit more? 3 minutes? 2, okay. Thanks, that's what I needed to know. So one was in the state of Washington, where there was a big fight over over a coal-fired power plant. I'm not going to go into all the details. Obviously, the union representing the workers in the plant thought the plant should stay open. The environmentalists said, no, we're pro-worker and pro-union, and we want the workers who are there to be retrained to do green energy, clean energy. And the workers in the plant went around to various community meetings and stuff and said, this is a crock. This is not going to do us any good. Fortunately, the environmentalist had background track record of working with these people before, and so they had a series of meetings in which the union people said, look, most of our workers are at least in their 50s, if not more. They don't want to be retrained. What they're worried about is that their kids can't live in the county that they grew up in and find a job. And so what they're really concerned about is A, what's going to happen to them to get them to retirement, and B, what's going to be the happen as far as can we get some kind of economic development here. And so actually the environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, took the position that the unions were frozen out of the negotiations between the state governor and the Environmental Protection Agency and the environmental groups. The environmental groups said, we are not going to approve a settlement of this and a plan for closing the plant until the needs of the people in the plant are taken care of. And so in the negotiation, what happened is that there was a phased plan for closing it, and one part of the plant they agreed could run 2 years longer than they had originally demanded, so that people who were working there would be able to leave with their pensions. And the other parts closed on the schedule they were planning. So a slight adjustment that made a big difference for the people who were working there. And the company agreed to put in a substantial nest egg for economic development around green energy and other kinds of local economic development that would be used in that county as a way of starting to create some new businesses, new activities to create some jobs for the people who are working in that county. Now, this is not utopia. This is not an overall, this is not solving the problems at level 1 and 2 that I talked about, but it does provide a way of thinking about what to do in these situations which are so fraught with conflict. And so the next to the last thing I want to say is anybody who's involved with those conflicts, this little book I did called Jobs Beyond Coal is essentially a guide for environmental groups of how to approach labor and how to develop alternative plans and ways to talk about alternatives for the local economy when you're shutting down a coal plant. And what I want to do is encourage anyone who's involved with any of these situations where there is a purported jobs versus environment situation to think about ways that can be moved away from direct head-on conflict towards some degree of saying we all have legitimate interests here and let's figure out how we're going to deal with them. Last point. We tend to think about this, and the media constantly portrays this as, there's the people working there, there's environmentalists, that's one group of people, that's climate activists and people like that, and people who care about polar bears over here, and then there's workers and unions over here, and that's a different group of people, different group of human beings. And we need to constantly, when we address these questions, say, climate is not just an environmental issue. Climate is an issue of everybody's survival and everybody's well-being. And conversely, jobs are not just a labor issue. Jobs are not just about unions, and they're not just about people whose primary identification is with the labor movement. Jobs are something that, except for the 1% who have enough money to not, but for the 99% jobs, whether we're environmentalists or whatever we think we are in our heads, we also need to make a living. And so that fundamental idea should go head on against the idea that somehow these issues are jobs versus the environment.
Thanks very much. I have to say, there's a